Obviously, it's been a pretty busy year for you, your candidacy, winning the leadership, and then the AGM, and then your tour. So, amongst all that, what are some moments that really stand out to you?
Yeah, looking back, we introduced some really exciting private member bills. So that was my first crack at that can. We introduced vacancy control to stop for-profit evictions in BC, as well as truth in advertising on greenwashing. But I also brought forward my own package on tax reform on the ultra wealthy to shore up about over $13 billion in revenue, and it would only affect about 650 British Columbians, and so of the 0.01%. So that was a really exciting development on the policy side. Um, on the Karga side, I was tracking that progress really closely. Didn't have all the outcomes we pushed for. I would give it a 60% grade, but we did have some substantial government commitments and further promises to hold them to account. Um, but yeah, I'm happy with issues like making progress on the spousal clawback, on disability payments. And then yeah, from there at the AGM, jumped right into the tour. It was pretty historic to sort of see a wave of energy coming onto provincial council as well as the 95% backing for our anti-genocide motion. So yeah, that was a great moment this fall as well. Um, and then yeah, digging into the tour, we started in Prince George, which is really ground zero of forestry collapse, and we met with unions that are developing a truly sustainable strategy for workers and the forests. And yeah, that was really inspiring to see how communities are coming together to reclaim their industry and chart forward real solutions that protect both these ecosystems and jobs in situations of real precarity. Um, and so yeah, Prince George, and then we went more into sort of emerging gas pipeline country with on Gibson and Gittinau territories in Hazelton. And yeah, we met with many communities that are facing down the mega-backed PRGT pipeline. And so that was, you know, uh, intense, but um, really important to hear that reality and also speak to city councillors in Kitimat and Terrace who are living through this, or at least in Kitimat with the LNG flare, how that's impacted asthma rates, um, driven up housing costs and put strain on social services. And so yeah, I think it was important for our tour as we traveled the province, um, you know, looking at who controls the main economies and extractive industries in BC, who's really profiting from these industries, and what we could do to, in some cases, break up these monopolies and deliver real benefits to communities. So it was very inspiring. This is maybe the last anecdote I'll share about the North, but in Prince Rupert, um, you know, deregulation and overharvesting in the 80s led to a total collapse of the fishing market industry there. And of course, Jim Pattison, when that market collapsed, kind of swooped in and bought up the whole industry and consolidated his control. So now that community is one of the most food insecure in all of BC. It has the highest rate of child poverty, despite being, surrounded by such a natural bounty. 90% of the fish that is caught is foreign owned and shipped overseas. And so, yeah, speaking to people in the fisheries there, changing to an owner-operator model to receive a quota system would actually really break up this monopoly. And we also spoke to nations like Lacolams that are clawing back some of these fishery licenses from Jim Pattison and are, actively taking back control of the fish fish industry there. Um, and so, yeah, that was really inspiring to see how communities are, you know, between a rock and a hard place, but actively building solutions that work for them that are going to generate local wealth, local jobs, and real food security. Um, and then, yeah, similarly, yeah, there was yeah, other communities that are very frankly abandoned by the government. But I'm thinking on Gixan territories, but on nation territories, they're building affordable housing and childcare facilities, and it's all powered by renewable energy. And like there's a major like or there's like a big sort of school gym and health facility all sort of on a 3 acre plot. They just unveiled a public facility for sausage processing and meat processing for like anyone in the public to come in and process their game. So there was just so many inspiring examples in the North of what people are doing to um, yeah, take back their future.
No, good to see people finding local solutions like that. And so you called it the Fight the Oligarchs tour. Now, that word is kind of new for a lot of people in their political vocabulary. And so when you tell people, we want to tax the rich, does everyone automatically know who you're referring to, or does it take a bit of explaining?
Um, I think in younger crowds, it doesn't take explaining. But in, yeah, slightly older crowds, like, I always just do the due diligence of explaining who the rich is. And, it's not surgeons even making $500,000 a year or people. I think the dividing line is people who are earning their wealth, building their wealth, or building wealth versus extracting wealth passively. And so, and there's a real dividing line as well, just in terms of like sheer income and assets. I'm talking about the 650 households in BC that are, in the centimillionaire and billionaire range, who are taxed at the same level as a doctor. So it's yeah, definitely something that I like work in as our like political education. But I do find it to be just a really useful word, and it was recently popularized by, Bernie Sanders campaigns and Zoran Mamdani in the States. So I think it's becoming more and more part of our cultural language to describe the political influence of the 0.01%, and their control over extractive industry and corporations.
So while you were on tour, Carney and Smith signed their MOU, and you swore that you were going to make sure a pipeline never comes to the North Coast. Now, it's been argued that pipeline or LNG project will provide jobs and economic benefit for communities up north, including First Nations. So when you were up there, what was your economic pitch to those communities?
Yeah, so with the North Coast pipeline, you know, we tried this about 10 years ago with the Northern Gateway project, and uh, coastal First Nations communities were deeply opposed to the project to the point at which that Enbridge actually pulled out or, started to exit the project before it was actually canceled. And so, yeah, I think we've we've seen this story play out. It was an incredibly divisive issue that, cost a lot of taxpayer money to have that debate and to force that conversation onto nations. And yeah, I think, you know, this concept of economic reconciliation is really being driven by industry and government. It's not being defined by nations. And so I think we need to look at the broader context and the way that nations have been pushed onto um, ever smaller pieces of land um, with, limited access to resources. There's been an active drain from the colonial governments on their wealth and autonomy. And um, and so I really see so many nations now between a rock and a hard place. They can either choose to have their lands and waters destroyed by foreign multinationals or live in abject poverty. And to me, that doesn't feel like a fair choice. That doesn't feel that to me is economic coercion when a government is only proposing or an industry is only proposing, um, you know, a a pretty invasive extractive project as their way to economic prosperity. I think the government should be stepping up with other options on the table, considering this long history of um, very tangible financial drain and yeah, because I think when I've looked at polling and through the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, um, the vast majority of nations would prioritize the development of renewable energy or transmission lines on their lands over oil and gas. So that to me says that, you know, we need to be putting more options on the table. We need to be offering diversification funds. If nations, I was just speaking to a nation that is cutting down old growth in their community, which is, incredibly painful for them, but they are just needing to make up the short-term revenue to pay for social workers and community services. Um, but they were like, yeah, we would love to have a diversification fund for government to pay for things or to transition to things like ecotourism, to, ship recycling, because they have sort of oceanside access. And so, I think there's so many situations that are unfolding like that, where the government is propping up or industry is propping up nations as being partners in this project, but it is through the conditions of economic coercion. And so, yeah, I'm deeply concerned about this project. And I think it's a major distraction from the real work and the real prosperity that we could have as British Columbians, doing things like yeah, scaling up renewables with good union jobs, building all the affordable housing that we need but currently don't have, and even exploring new renewables like geothermal in abandoned oil wells um, and yeah, um, restoring the many sites of ecological damage across this province. Um, and yeah, I think it's also as part of our like just transition, better valuing um, low carbon professions like healthcare, teachers, and artists. We've seen similar examples even in Ireland of yeah, offering just a higher standard of care and living to healthcare workers and teachers, and seeing this as part of our transition away from fossil fuels, and yeah, supporting reskilling with free tuition. Um, and so, yeah, I think I just see this oil pipeline as a major distraction and an abuse of power on behalf of Daniel Smith and Mark Carney. BC has said no. Most importantly, coastal First Nations have said no. So I think the this conversation is just a spit in the face in the height of an affordability crisis where we could be investing so much more time and energy into things that would actually generate long-term jobs. I think, some of the industries and alternatives that I named would generate 3 times the number of long-term jobs as fossil fuels. And, with this project in particular, I think it would generate maybe I think it's about less than 200 permanent jobs.
Mm.
Obviously there's more in construction, but this is what so many communities were saying in the tour is that they're sick of this boom and bust cycle that offers them scraps during the boom and then they're left in the lurch and uh, yeah, so I think it's really important that we listen to those concerns and we yeah, respect coastal First Nations. Um, I will also say briefly just on sort of the economics. Um, I don't think that this is the boon that people think it is. Um, like I think it's so fundamentally absurd that this project would be considered a nation building project. Um, we want to move away from exporting to the US. I think that's great. I support that. But in the case of oil, the Asian markets we're looking for are quite literally evaporating. China's oil consumption peaked last year. They're quickly electrifying and are simply not going to be a part of the oil conversation by the time that the pipeline would come online. And so, when we look at Trans Mountain, it took over 12 years to build. It took over $50 billion in taxpayers' pockets, and it can't even operate at full capacity. And so, yeah, and in global markets, like even JP Morgan predicts that oil prices will fall by 50% in the next 2 years. So I honestly think that the only thing this project would do is line the pockets of oil lobbyists who run Daniel Smith's office. And uh, the vast majority of companies that lobby her, or like, the majority of tar sands companies or oil majors in Canada are uh, 50% or more owned by American equity or American oil majors. So it's like, there's a real sort of yeah, American influence in this conversation as well.
David Eby, he's been pretty clear he doesn't support the pipeline. Hmm. And he's been on the side of coastal First Nations. But he hasn't really proposed any of the things that you were just talking about to keep the economy going and provide
Mhm.
long-term jobs. And
Yeah.
between that and going back and forth on DRIPA and property rights, that whole thing, does this point to a larger failing in his handling of reconciliation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will also say that we have seen him waver on the pipeline issue. I think in the last statement he released, he said that, he's open to the pipeline, but talk to coastal First Nations and we should still uphold the tanker ban. So I don't know how those, that's it's just we've seen him fold on so many other issues, and even this slight sort of narrative weakening and position weakening is deeply concerning. And it's no surprise when he uses the same legislation, fast tracking legislation, to ram through a MAGA-backed gas pipeline on those same territories. And so, I don't think we can trust him to stay strong on this issue, but we'll certainly hold his feet to the fire. Um, and yeah, sorry, what was the question?
Oh, just if it points to a broader issue with
Yeah,
his handling of
yes, yeah.
reconciliation.
Um, yeah, I think, I mean, Evie has just fumbled the land title conversation. And so rather than leading with clarity and good faith with First Nations, he really let fear and confusion fill the air, and the Conservatives swooped in to stoke it. Um, and I think, land title was always going to come up. First Nations have been in court for decades, winning title cases because uh, governments refuse to resolve the underlying issue. And I think DRIPA was meant to move us past that mess by embedding respect for rights and consent into law. And instead, the NDP stalled on implementation and left a real vacuum of uncertainty. Um, yeah, and so I think Premier Eby's plan to amend DRIPA is quite a dangerous, slippery slope. I came out with a statement and was supported by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs um, to, yeah, challenge any amendments that would weaken DRIPA. Because I think by ceding ground to anti-Indigenous voices, he risks diluting a framework that is meant to guide the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights and title. That needs to be resolved through negotiation, not by tinkering with legislation that just to appease fear-mongering voices. Um, and so, yeah, I think. It's just yeah, it's really disappointing to see how EB has just adopted, the this weakened frame. And in cases like Cowichan, there's a clear paper trail showing land historically taken without consent. And instead of honestly facing that history and negotiating forward, the government's mishandling has put First Nations in the political crossfire. I honestly think that's really tragic and avoidable. Um, First Nations leadership themselves have said that public comments about this case were at times misleading and inflammatory. And it's the Crown's job to reconcile title, not politicians' sound bites. So I think there's so many positive examples that exist, looking at shared benefit, from Haida Gwa's full title to arrangements at YVR with the Musqueam Nation, to how the Lekwungen territory and the legislature sit in partnership. Um, but those stories get drowned out when fear is driving the narrative. The sky didn't fall when Haida Gwaii won full title of their territories and moved to a stronger model of self-governance. There are settlers with property who live on those lands, and we didn't hear much about that at all, despite it being, yeah, a similar situation. And so I think thinking about, yeah, our position at the Greens, like, DRIPA isn't the enemy here. I think political cowardice is. DRIPA didn't invent rights. I think it honors, well, it honors the rights that are already guaranteed in Section 35 of the Constitution and the treaties. Those don't go away. Those stand alone, and the government needs to stop fear-mongering and start negotiating good faith frameworks with First Nations, so this law can actually work as intended.
Yeah, and you can't really blame people for not really knowing what's going on because the messaging is so inconsistent. And,
Exactly.
I was at a town hall in Richmond right after the decision was laid out, and everyone everyone had a different idea of what the situation was like. And, when I asked the mayor of Richmond why didn't you tell people that their properties were at risk? He said, oh, that was the Cowichan's job. And same thing with EB. And so the blame was, or the what do you call it? The need for due diligence was shifted to the First Nations
Mhm.
instead of, the government
Exactly.
taking charge and just telling people, hey, this is the situation.
Hmm. Exactly.
And on that note, a lot of the negotiations between First Nations and the government, it's not very transparent to the average person, to taxpayers. And the conservatives, they've talked about maybe doing away with some of that secrecy and making information more accessible. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, we need to see that kind of transparency and clarity. And I think, yeah, people, it's understandable. We're in an affordability and housing crisis. People feel a great sense of precarity right now. So it's not surprising that when you know, the conservatives take hold of this issue and are speaking about or and even local mayors and municipalities are issuing misinformation to homeowners about their land title, then it's not surprising that this issue flared. And so yeah, and I just really think that the government poorly handled it and that there wasn't that clarity of communication. There was, waffling in position from AG Sharma and Premier EB. So yeah, I think it's really important that we come back in the new year and we hold the line, preventing any amendments that would weaken DRIPA, but clearly communicate this issue to all municipalities. And I think that looks like, doing deeper groundwork to, get in the Facebook groups and sort of like the channels that people are actually communicating. Um, yeah.
And yeah, just shifting topics slightly. So you're the only party leader who's really spoken out about this. So I got to ask, why is David Eby so afraid of electoral reform?
Um, hmm. I think Dave hates democracy. I don't know. It's 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 not a major surprise. Much of the legislation in the last year has been all about consolidating control in the premier's office. Fast tracking legislation that steamrolls the rights of nations and brings more power into his domain. Um, and when we look back at the 2018 referendum, David Eby was responsible for drafting those questions. And it included options that had literally never been enacted anywhere in the world. It was deeply confusing. And the fact that the questions were designed with such, confusing policy specific language in what is, a public facing referendum. Um, and breaking up those options and effectively, vote splitting, across proportional representation options. It was designed and doomed to fail from the outset. So I think his track record is pretty consistent on suppressing popular will on this issue, and you know, more people participated in the Committee on Democratic and Electoral Reform. Um, there was about 1,000 people, and 93% advocated for a form of proportional representation this past year to generate this recommendation on a citizens' assembly, which could actually legislate an outcome on proportional representation. Um, so, that to me, 1,000 people taking time out of their day to advocate for proportional representation is really significant. That's more people than I think only about 700 participated in David Eby's leadership review. So, To me that is significant. And there's been, so many historical campaigns, Fair Vote Canada, others that are, generating um, public support and consensus on this issue. And I think, you know, just because the last referendum failed, um, to me, because the questions and the nature of the referendum was so intentionally confusing to the public that, we can't look at that as, a valid metric of public support. And so moving forward, I think we follow in the footsteps of New Zealand and we just legislate proportional representation. We try it out for a few election cycles, see how we like it, and then we can hold a public vote and a referendum on the issue. Um, they chose to keep their system, and it's been working tremendously well. So yeah, that's my pitch.
Yeah, he said British Columbians are, quote, done with that conversation, but doesn't sound like
He
it.
is.
And
Because
no,
they want a supermajority. They don't want to cooperate. They're constantly trying to wipe the Greens off the map, not work with us in um, or they don't want to share power with any party. Um, and I think, that's a real disservice to British Columbians who don't vote for the NDP. And it feels like common sense and basic math that if 30% or 20% of British Columbians vote for a party, that should be represented with 20% of the seat count. Um, so yeah.
yeah, a couple of fun ones. So I asked Trevor Halford, and I'd like to ask you as well. There's so much division and animosity these days, so just pick someone from an opposing party and just say something nice about him.
Um, I actually really appreciated uh, Amelia Boltby gave me a very warm welcome to the legislature, and yeah, have appreciated her openness and yeah um, just general like warmth as a woman in politics.
Nice. And do you follow the Twitter account No Context BC?
Um, I've seen it before. I don't know if I follow them.
Mhm.
Is
Well,
that is
you
that
definitely should, yeah.
a
It's just yeah, the best bits of BC politics just completely out of context, and it's always pretty fun.
Okay, yeah. I don't think I'm not on X
Uh,
very often, but people hate me on X. So I don't try to open it. Um, but yeah, that's a good tip.
yeah, I'll have to ask you next year then.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I guess last question as we look forward to 2026, what's your message to British Columbians?
I think my message is that we deserve better. And I think the disillusionment and the apathy and the anger that we feel is real. You know, half of us can't afford to pay our bills and are forking over, sometimes 70% of our rent, our income to rent. Um, and it feels like, everything is getting worse, and our concerns are really falling on deaf ears. Um, but you know, the BC Greens are generating what I think is a formidable political movement to challenge the status quo and to take on uh, the biggest corporations and the 1% in this province. And we're trying to, work with communities across BC to reclaim the economy for the working class. Um, and this is an incredibly exciting time to sort of force those solutions onto the table and into the public conversation. And yeah, I think the BC Greens under my leadership is the party of labor, it's the party of affordability, and it's the party of the future.
Well, with that, yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk to me, and yeah, all the best for the holidays and the year ahead.
Yeah, you too. Hope you get some good rest and yeah,
Um,
nice to talk to you.
yeah, thanks.
Okay. Bye.